Over a $3 million inheritance, my sister backstabbed our family, but karma hit her harder. When our grandmother Evelyn passed away last spring, she left her estate to be split equally among her 4 grandchildren. That should have meant $750,000 apiece for me, my sister Cordelia, and our cousins Jasper and Nell. But Cordelia had been working on Grandma for months before she died. The will reading was meant to be straightforward. Instead, the lawyer announced that Grandma had changed everything. Just 3 weeks before her death, Cordelia would receive the entire $3 million, while the rest of us got nothing but a few pieces of jewelry. I was devastated. That money was meant to help me buy my first house and pay off my student loans. Jasper needed it to cover his daughter's medical treatments. Nell was counting on it to keep her art studio from closing. But Cordelia, she already had everything. A successful dental practice, a mansion in Westchester, and a husband who owned 3 restaurants. Grandma knew I'd manage the money responsibly, she said afterward, not even trying to hide her smirk. Something felt wrong. Grandma had always been fair, always treated us equally. She'd promised each of us part of her inheritance since we were children. I decided to investigate. First, I visited Grandma's neighbor, Mrs. Petton, who had been her closest friend for 40 years. She told me something chilling. Over tea, she whispered that your grandmother had been terrified those last few weeks. She kept saying Cordelia was threatening her, but she wouldn't give me details. She seemed so frightened. Next, I spoke with Grandma's housekeeper, Rosa, who had worked for her for 15 years. Rosa broke down crying. Your sister, she came every day those last weeks, she said. She would lock herself in your grandmother's study with her for hours. Sometimes I heard your grandmother crying. When I asked if she was okay, your sister would say they were just discussing family business. I contacted the lawyer who had drawn up the new will. He seemed nervous when I pressed him about the circumstances. Your grandmother seemed distressed when she came in, he admitted, but she insisted this was what she wanted. Your sister was very persuasive about your grandmother's reasoning. The final piece came from Grandma's doctor. During a routine review of her medical records, I discovered something shocking. Grandma had been prescribed anxiety medication for the first time in her life just 4 weeks before she died. That prescription was filled the day after one of Cordelia's visits. I gathered all this evidence and took it to an attorney who specialized in elder abuse. He was confident we had a case for undue influence and coercion. The court battle lasted 8 months. During depositions, the truth emerged. Cordelia had systematically isolated Grandma, convinced her that Jasper was on drugs, that Nell was financially irresponsible, and that I was only kind to her for the money. She'd threatened to cut off all contact if Grandma didn't change the will. The judge ruled in our favor. Cordelia had to return every penny and also pay our legal fees and court costs. But karma wasn't finished with her yet. While the inheritance case was ongoing, the IRS had been watching Cordelia's finances. They discovered she'd been underreporting income from her dental practice for years. The inheritance money she'd spent on a new yacht and vacation home triggered an audit that uncovered $800,000 in tax fraud. She was arrested last Tuesday. Her practice was shut down, her assets frozen, and her dental license revoked. Yesterday, I got a call from her husband, Vincent. She wants to see you, he said, his voice shaking. She's in county jail, and she claims she has information about what really happened to your grandmother the night she died. My blood ran cold. Grandma had died peacefully in her sleep, or so we'd been told. I stared at my phone for a full minute after Vincent hung up. My hands were trembling. What could Cordelia possibly know about Grandma's death that we didn't? The coroner had ruled it natural causes, heart failure in her sleep. There had been no autopsy, no investigation, just the peaceful passing of a 92-year-old woman. But now, sitting in my kitchen with Vincent's words echoing in my head, I felt that familiar chill of suspicion creep up my spine. The same feeling I had when the will was read, the same instinct that had driven me to investigate Cordelia's manipulation in the first place. I called Jasper first. She's lying, he said immediately. She's desperate, grasping at anything to get sympathy or reduce her sentence. Don't give her the satisfaction. But Nell disagreed when I called her next. What if she isn't lying? She asked quietly. What if there's something we missed? I always wondered why Grandma seemed so weak those last few days, but the doctor said it was normal decline. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Grandma's final weeks, how frail she'd become, how confused she sometimes seemed. At the time, we'd attributed it to age and the stress from Cordelia's constant visits. But what if it had been something else? The next morning, I drove to the county jail. The visiting room was sterile and depressing, filled with plastic chairs and the smell of industrial disinfectant. When they brought Cordelia out, I barely recognized her. The confident, polished woman who'd stolen our inheritance was gone. In her place sat someone who looked 10 years older, with hollow cheeks and greasy hair pulled back in a ponytail. She sat across from me, separated by reinforced glass, and picked up the phone. Thank you for coming, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent said you had information about Grandma's death, I said, cutting straight to the point. Start talking, I told her. Cordelia's hands shook as she gripped the phone. I need to tell someone. It's been eating me alive. Tell me what, I said. She took a shuddering breath. Grandma didn't die naturally. I helped her along. The world tilted sideways. What do you mean you helped her along? She was going to change the will back, I said. Cordelia whispered, tears streaming down her face. After our last fight, Grandma had called her lawyer and said she was having second thoughts, that she wanted to restore the original terms. She was going to take everything away from me. My mouth went dry. So what did you do? I asked. I went to see her that night, told her I was sorry, that I wanted to make things right, she said. She let me in, made tea like she always did. Cordelia's voice cracked. I brought something with me, something I'd taken from my practice. What did you bring? I asked. Propofol, she said. It's an anesthetic we use for sedation. In small doses, it just makes you sleepy. But in larger doses, she couldn't finish the sentence. I felt sick. You put it in her tea, I said. Cordelia nodded, sobbing now. She trusted me. She drank the whole cup while telling me how proud she was that I'd come to apologize. Then she started getting drowsy. She said she felt strange. And then what happened? I asked. I helped her to bed, told her she just needed rest. She was so weak, so trusting. I sat with her until Cordelia's voice broke completely, until her breathing got slower and slower and then stopped. I stared at my sister through the glass, feeling a rage so pure it was almost blinding. You murdered her, I said. It was supposed to look natural, she said desperately. An elderly woman dies in her sleep. No one would question it, and they didn't. The coroner barely examined her. No autopsy, just signed the death certificate, she added. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I can't live with it anymore, she sobbed. Every night I see her face. I hear her last words. She said she loved me. She said she was proud of me for coming to make amends, and I killed her for money. I hung up the phone and walked out without another word. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and called the police. Detective Rodriguez met me at the station an hour later. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor who specialized in cold cases and elder abuse. This is a very serious allegation, she said after I'd explained everything. Do you have any evidence besides your sister's confession? I recorded it, I said, pulling out my phone. I know it's probably not admissible in court, but I recorded our conversation. Her eyebrows raised. That was smart thinking, she said. You're right, without her knowledge and consent, it won't be admissible, but it gives us a starting point. What happens now? We'll need to exhume your grandmother's body for an autopsy. Propofol can still be detected months after death if we know what to look for. We'll also need a warrant for your sister's dental practice records to see if there are any missing controlled substances. The thought of disturbing Grandma's rest made me sick, but I knew it was necessary. How long will all this take? Weeks? Maybe months? I asked. These cases are complex, she said, but if your sister really did what she's claiming, we'll find the evidence. I left the station feeling drained but determined. Cordelia had manipulated and terrorized our grandmother, stolen our inheritance, and now I'd learned she'd actually murdered the woman who'd raised us with nothing but love and kindness. But I wasn't done yet. Over the next few days, I reached out to everyone who'd had contact with Grandma during her final weeks. I called her doctor again, this time asking specific questions about her symptoms. I visited Mrs. Piton again, pressing for more details about Grandma's behavior and complaints. The picture that emerged was devastating. Dr. Morrison, Grandma's physician, told me that she'd complained of unusual fatigue and confusion during her last checkup. I attributed it to stress and advanced age, he said, but looking back, some of her symptoms could have been consistent with intermittent poisoning. Mrs. Piton revealed that Grandma had mentioned feeling foggy after Cordelia's visits. She said she couldn't think straight sometimes, like her mind was wrapped in cotton. I thought it was just the stress of their arguments. Even Rosa, the housekeeper, had noticed things that seemed insignificant at the time. The last 2 weeks, your grandmother seemed different after your sister's visits. Sleepy, confused. Sometimes she'd forget conversations we'd had just hours before. It painted a horrifying picture. Cordelia had been slowly poisoning Grandma with small doses of propofol during her visits, weakening her mentally and physically to make her more susceptible to manipulation. When that wasn't enough, when Grandma had decided to change the will back, Cordelia had administered a fatal dose. The exhumation took place on a gray October morning. I wasn't there. I couldn't bear to watch. But Detective Rodriguez called me that afternoon. We found it, she said simply. Propofol was in the tissue samples, consistent with a large dose administered shortly before death. We're arresting your sister for first-degree murder. The trial began 4 months later. The courtroom was packed with family, friends, and reporters who'd picked up the story of the inheritance murder. Cordelia sat at the defendant's table looking small and broken, flanked by 2 public defenders who'd been assigned to her after her assets had been frozen. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence of Cordelia's financial motivations, her systematic manipulation of Grandma, and the physical proof of propofol poisoning. They brought in expert witnesses who explained how the drug worked and why it would have been a perfect murder weapon, difficult to detect without specific testing, easily explained as a natural death in an elderly person. But the most damning evidence came from Cordelia's own dental practice. The police had obtained a warrant and discovered that controlled substance logs had been falsified. Multiple vials of propofol were unaccounted for, with fake entries covering the discrepancies. One of her former dental assistants, Belle, testified that she'd noticed missing medications, but had been afraid to report it. Dr. Cordelia was very intimidating, she said. When I asked about the missing propofol, Belle said Cordelia had told her she'd used it for a difficult procedure and forgot to log it, making Belle promise not to mention it to anyone. The defense tried to argue that Cordelia's confession was the result of a mental breakdown and guilt over her grandmother's natural death. They painted her as a grieving granddaughter who'd convinced herself she was responsible for something that wasn't her fault. But the physical evidence was too strong. The propofol in Grandma's system, the missing drugs from the practice, the pattern of symptoms Mrs. Peton and others had described. On the third day of testimony, the prosecution called me to the stand. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Bethany Walsh, walked me through my investigation step by step. How I'd first suspected something was wrong with the will, how I'd gathered evidence of elder abuse, how I discovered Cordelia's manipulation and coercion. Then she asked me about my jailhouse visit with Cordelia. She confessed to murdering your grandmother, Walsh said. How did that make you feel? Devastated, I answered, looking directly at Cordelia but not surprised. She'd already stolen from our family, terrorized an elderly woman, and committed fraud. Murder was just the next step. Cordelia's defense attorney objected, but the judge allowed it. In your opinion, Walsh continued, was your sister's confession believable? Absolutely, I said. It explained everything that had seemed wrong about Grandma's final weeks. The confusion, the weakness, the fear. Cordelia had been slowly poisoning her to make her easier to control. During cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to suggest I had my own financial motivations for pursuing the case, that I was angry about losing the inheritance and willing to believe anything that would punish my sister. You filed a civil suit to recover the inheritance money, didn't you? He asked. Yes, because she obtained it through elder abuse and fraud, I replied. And you stood to gain significantly if she was convicted of murder and couldn't contest the return of that money. I stood to gain justice for my grandmother, I said firmly. The money was never about me. It was about stopping someone who terrorized and murdered an innocent woman. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Cordelia collapsed in her chair, sobbing. Her public defender put a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. In New York, first-degree murder carried a possible sentence of life in prison without parole. During those 3 weeks, I received several calls from Vincent. Cordelia's husband was falling apart. His restaurants were failing without his wife's dental practice to provide financial stability. The legal fees and public scandal had destroyed his reputation. She wants to see you again, he said during our last conversation. Before the sentencing, she says she has more to tell you. I almost refused. What more could there be, I asked. But something in his voice made me reconsider. This time when I visited the jail, Cordelia looked even worse. She'd lost more weight and her hands shook constantly. Thank you for coming, she said when I sat down. I know you hate me. You murdered our grandmother, I said flatly. Hate doesn't begin to cover it. I need to tell you something else about the inheritance, she said. What about it, I asked. Cordelia took a shuddering breath. Grandma never actually signed the final will, she confessed. I stared at her. What do you mean? The will that gave me everything. She never signed it. The lawyer was lying. My blood ran cold. Explain, I demanded. I forged her signature, she whispered. The lawyer, Donovan Peters, he's been falsifying estate documents for years. I paid him $50,000 to backdate the will and forge Grandma's signature. She died before she could sign anything. This was bigger than I'd imagined. So the original will stands? I asked. Yes, the one that splits everything equally among the 4 grandchildren. That was her last legally valid will. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because Peters is still out there, still scamming families, and because I hesitated. Because I want you to know that even at the end, Grandma never chose me over the rest of you. I lied about that too. I left the jail and went straight to the police. Detective Rodriguez assigned a financial crimes unit to investigate Donovan Peters. Within a week, they'd uncovered a massive estate fraud operation. Peters had been forging wills, falsifying probate documents, and stealing from grieving families for over a decade. The raid on his office turned up files on dozens of cases. Fake wills, forged signatures, backdated documents. Some families had been fighting legal battles for years over estates that had been fraudulently altered. Peters was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. His law license was immediately suspended, and the state bar began reviewing every case he'd handled in the past 15 years. But the revelation about the will created a new problem for our family. Since Cordelia had never legally inherited the money, and since she'd spent most of it before her arrest, recovering our shares became complicated. The yacht had been repossessed. The vacation home was in foreclosure. Her dental practice assets had been liquidated to pay legal fees. We managed to recover about 60% of the total inheritance, enough for each of us to get $450,000 instead of the original $750,000. It wasn't everything, but it was justice. Jasper used his share to pay for his daughter's medical treatments and set up a trust fund for her future care. Nell saved her art studio and opened a second location. I bought a modest house and paid off my student loans just like I'd originally planned. The sentencing hearing was packed again. Grandma's friends filled the gallery along with reporters and some of Peter's other victims who'd come to see justice served. Before the judge announced the sentence, he allowed victim impact statements. I'd written mine the night before, trying to capture not just what Cordelia had done to me, but what she'd stolen from our entire family. Your Honor, I began, standing at the podium, my sister didn't just murder my grandmother. She murdered the woman who raised 4 orphaned grandchildren with nothing but love and patience. She murdered a woman who taught us that family meant loyalty, kindness, and fairness. She murdered a woman who spent her final weeks in terror because someone she trusted was slowly poisoning her. I looked at Cordelia, who was staring at her hands. My grandmother died believing that her granddaughter loved her. She died trusting someone who was killing her for money. That betrayal of trust, that violation of love, that's what makes this crime so heinous. Jasper spoke next, his voice thick with emotion as he described how Grandma had helped raise his daughter after his wife died, how she'd been the only grandmother his little girl had ever known. Nell read a letter from Grandma's childhood friend, who was too elderly to attend. It described a woman who'd spent her life helping others, who'd taken in 4 grieving children and raised them as her own, who deserved to die surrounded by love, not fear. When it was time for the defense to speak, Cordelia's attorney made a brief plea for mercy, citing her previously clean record and her cooperation with the Peters investigation. Then the judge spoke. Mrs. Cordelia Montgomery, he said, using her married name, you have been convicted of the premeditated murder of your own grandmother, a woman who loved and trusted you. This crime is particularly heinous because of the breach of trust involved and the vulnerable nature of your victim. He paused, looking at Cordelia directly. Your victim was a 92-year-old woman who depended on family for care and support. Instead of protection, you gave her terror. Instead of love, you gave her poison. Instead of honoring her memory, you tried to steal from her other grandchildren. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Cordelia's quiet sobbing. I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down with finality. Cordelia was led away in shackles, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like I could breathe. But the story wasn't quite over yet. 3 months after the sentencing, Detective Rodriguez called me with an update on the Peters investigation. We've uncovered 17 other cases where he falsified estate documents, she said. Your sister's cooperation has been crucial in identifying the victims. Some of these families have been fighting legal battles for years without knowing their documents were forged. What happens to them now? I asked. Most will be able to recover their rightful inheritances. Some cases are more complicated, but your sister's testimony has opened the door for justice. It was a small comfort knowing that Cordelia's confession had helped other families. It didn't bring Grandma back, and it didn't erase the trauma of the past year, but it was something. 6 months later, I received a letter in the mail with Cordelia's name and the return address. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single page written in her familiar handwriting. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I know saying sorry doesn't bring her back or undo what I did, but I need you to know that I think about her every day. I dream about her most nights. Not nightmares, but memories of when we were kids and she'd make us hot chocolate on snow days, or read us stories before bed. I destroyed our family. I destroyed myself. I destroyed the memory of the most loving person in our lives. There's no excuse for what I did. No explanation that makes it acceptable. I hope someday you can find peace. I hope Jasper's daughter grows up healthy and happy. I hope Nell's art studio thrives. I hope you love your new house and that it feels like the home Grandma always wanted us to have. I hope you can remember the good parts of her without thinking about how she died. She deserved better than what I gave her. Your sister, Cordelia. I read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in a drawer. I wasn't ready to forgive her, might never be ready, but it was something, knowing she understood the weight of what she'd done. A year later, on the anniversary of Grandma's death, Jasper, Nell, and I gathered at her grave. We'd had her headstone replaced with something more fitting, a beautiful granite monument engraved with her favorite Bible verse and surrounded by a small garden. We brought flowers and photos and spent the afternoon sharing memories, good ones this time, from before everything went wrong. Stories about holiday dinners and summer vacations, about scraped knees she'd bandaged and school projects she'd helped with. Jasper's daughter, now 8 and healthy thanks to the treatments the inheritance had paid for, picked dandelions and placed them carefully around the headstone. Tell me about great-grandma again, she said, settling cross-legged on the grass. And we did. We told her about a woman who'd taken in 4 scared children and loved them unconditionally, who taught us that family wasn't just about blood but about loyalty, kindness, and sacrifice. We didn't mention the betrayal or the murder or the trials. Those weren't Grandma's story. They were Cordelia's. And they didn't get to define the woman who'd raised us or the love she'd given us. As the sun began to set, we gathered our things and prepared to leave. But before we got to our cars, Nell pulled out a manila envelope. "I have something for both of you," she said. "I found these when I was cleaning out Grandma's house." Inside were 3 letters, one for each of us, in Grandma's familiar handwriting. They were dated just a week before she died. Mine read, "My dearest granddaughter, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and my lawyer has followed my instructions to give you this letter. I want you to know how proud I am of the woman you've become. You were always the one who stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. I'm worried about your sister. She's been coming to see me more often lately, and she seems troubled. I think she's in some kind of financial difficulty, though she won't admit it. She keeps talking about the inheritance and how much she could do with it. I've told her that everything will be divided equally, just as I promised all of you, but she seems fixated on the idea that she deserves more. I need you to promise me something. If anything happens to me, and if there are any questions about my will or my wishes, please fight for what's right. Don't let anyone take advantage of our family's grief. The original will I signed 5 years ago reflects my true wishes. Everything divided equally among my 4 grandchildren. I love you more than words can say. Take care of your cousins and don't let this family be torn apart by greed or selfishness. All my love, Grandma." I looked up to see Jasper and Nell reading their own letters, tears streaming down their faces. Their letters contained similar warnings about Cordelia and similar instructions to protect the family. "She knew," Nell whispered. "She knew something was wrong, but she never suspected murder," Jasper said quietly. "She thought it was just about money." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my purse. Even from the grave, Grandma was still trying to protect us, still trying to keep our family together. It had taken almost 2 years, but justice had finally been served. Cordelia was in prison for life. Peters was awaiting trial for his fraud schemes. The inheritance had been properly distributed, and most importantly, the truth about Grandma's death was known. But the real victory wasn't in the convictions or the money recovered. It was in the fact that we'd honored Grandma's memory by fighting for what was right. We'd refused to let her death be in vain or her killer go unpunished. And we'd kept our promise to take care of each other. That evening, Jasper, Nell, and I had dinner together at the restaurant where we'd first discussed challenging the will. It felt fitting somehow to close this chapter of our lives in the same place where we decided to fight back. "Do you think she would have been proud of us?" Nell asked as we raised our glasses in a toast. "I think she would have been proud that we stood up for each other," I said. "That we didn't let Cordelia tear the family apart and that we got justice," Jasper added. "She always taught us that actions have consequences." We clinked glasses and drank to Grandma's memory, not to the frightened, confused woman Cordelia had terrorized in her final weeks, but to the strong, loving matriarch who'd raised us to know right from wrong. 2 years later, I received another call from Detective Rodriguez. Cordelia had died in prison, a heart attack according to the medical examiner. She was 41 years old. Vincent called me a few days later to let me know about the funeral arrangements. It was a small service attended by maybe 20 people, her former employees from the dental practice, a few neighbors, Vincent's family. I didn't go. Neither did Jasper or Nell. Instead, we spent that day at Grandma's grave again, planting the rose bushes we'd been meaning to add to her garden. It seemed like a better way to honor the dead, by nurturing life and beauty rather than dwelling on darkness and betrayal. "Do you think we should feel bad?" Nell asked as we worked in the soil about not going to the funeral. "No," I said firmly. "She made her choices. We don't owe her our grief. But she was still our sister," Jasper said quietly. "She stopped being our sister the night she murdered Grandma," I replied. "Family isn't just about DNA. It's about love and loyalty and trust. She destroyed all of that." We finished planting the roses as the sun began to set. They were Grandma's favorite variety, pink peace roses that would bloom every spring and summer, bringing color and life to her resting place. As we gathered our tools and prepared to leave, I thought about everything that had happened: the betrayal, the investigation, the trials, the convictions, all the pain and anger and grief we'd endured to get justice. But I also thought about the good that had come from it. Jasper's daughter was healthy. Nell's art studio was thriving. I'd found my purpose in life, working as a victim advocate for families dealing with elder abuse and estate fraud. And most importantly, we'd kept our promise to Grandma. We'd taken care of each other. We'd fought for what was right. We'd made sure her memory was honored. The roses would bloom for years to come, long after we were gone, just like Grandma's love for us. Eternal, beautiful, and unshakable. That was her real legacy. Not the money she'd left us, but the values she'd instilled in us. The strength to fight for justice. The courage to stand up to bullies and criminals even when they were family. The wisdom to know that some betrayals are unforgivable. And the grace to let love and beauty flourish even in the shadow of tragedy. As we drove away from the cemetery that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over 3 years. Peace. The kind of deep, lasting peace that comes from knowing you've done everything possible to honor someone's memory and protect the people you love. Grandma was finally at rest. Cordelia couldn't hurt anyone anymore, and our family, what was left of it, was stronger than ever. Justice had been served, love had triumphed over greed, and the roses would bloom forever.